I feel like the price of undiagnosed and untreated ADHD is far higher for women than it is for men because my experience with the men that I know who have ADHD is that they kind of just blow it off and they're like, you know what? Fuck that shit. Like, oh, whatever. It's too hard. I'm not going to do it. And they blow it off and they do something else.
Welcome to Amy Liz Harrison's podcast, Eternally Amy, a mum of eight's journey from jail to joy, a Gen Xer who overcame her struggle with alcohol to become a best-selling author and mental health advocate. She shares stories of hope and offers ideas for others struggling with mental health challenges. One thing is for sure, you'll leave with something to chew on. And now, here's your host, Amy Liz Harrison.
Greetings, compadres. This is part two of a deep dive into the dungeon of ADHD, or the ADHD dungeon, whichever way you want to go with it. And so I won't give a huge recap. I'm just going to direct you to part one if you want to get caught up. But I do want to remind you really quick that I'm not a doctor. I am a best-selling author. I am a certified life coach and a meditation teacher, among a bunch of other things. But I learn the things that I share from my doctors, and then I share with my doctors my life experiences and my symptoms of ADHD and how they show up for me. And I have my doctors confirm, like, so is this that, I'm telling you about, is this really ADHD or is this just being human? So, and then they confirm, no, that's indicative of ADHD. And so I just say that because I just want you to know I'm not on a jag of self-justification. So this is me sharing my experiences with the professionals in my life, their confirmations and thoughts on that, and any resources they have that will help me with my life. And then I'm passing it on to you. So as all of this is said, I just want it to be known that, of course, I encourage you to get your own psychiatrists and therapists, do your own mental health work, your own behavioral health journey, and rely on the medical and health professionals in your life. So the brief recap is, I told you in part one what it's like to live with ADHD, and that it's like an orchestra and everybody is playing at the same time. And when the conductor comes in and tries to tap his wand on, or her wand on the side of a music stand, most normal brains can follow that direction and then just have the strings or, the horns or whatever, just one section play at a time. But the ADHD brain, at least unmedicated, does not do that. So we talked about that. And then I talked about throwing the kitchen sink at my ADHD. So, and my recovery. So whatever I can find that may potentially work, I'm here for it. And I encourage you to be here for yourself and just seek it out, because once you have that diagnosis, it's your superpower. Information is power, and it's empowering to know what you're dealing with and what the problem is that you are facing. Because when you know what the problems are, then you can find solutions. I apologize. One of my kids' phones just went off. We keep their phones in our room at night, and we usually try and make sure everything is shut off, but apparently we have not done that with one phone. So here's the deal. Part two starts here. So now we know what the problem is. And I mentioned last time that I've learned from my doctors that in the 1970s, the late 1970s, when ADHD research and testing started to become a thing, boys were tested. So girls were simply not tested. And for boys, it was kind of a cut and dry thing, as far as I understand it, because ADHD presents itself as being distracted, being fidgety, being very physical with their inability to concentrate. And I shared last time about a boy who sat across the classroom from me when I was in elementary school, and we'd have these timed math quizzes. And every time he would just get anxiety ridden, and he would like stomp his feet and he'd like scratch. And I just remember watching the show. That's all I could see was him. I could not concentrate on my quiz. And so I failed and I wound up in special ed math. Anyway, girls, on the other hand, have very different symptoms, at least in the way that they present themselves, right? Very different symptoms. And in fact, I would go so far to call it, for those in the recovery world, unmanageability. So it definitely makes my life unmanageable when I am not treating my ADHD. And along life's way, that has been very evident. It has been evident that I was undiagnosed and untreated for a long time, as in multiple decades, 4 decades. So for girls, our symptoms are more internal. So we're restless. We live in our head, ruminating over things, fantasizing about different things, chiefly about like getting our shit together, those kind of fantasies. We're extremely hard on ourselves. We're forgetful, we're disorganized. And what we do is we start to aim it at ourselves as a character flaw. Because at least if you're Generation X and you grew up in the 70s, 80s, beginning of the 90s, this was still foreign as far as girls were concerned, right? And it was like, why aren't you paying attention? What is wrong with you? You know, your locker is a mess. Teachers being very critical, and parents being very critical of girls with ADHD because they didn't know what it was, and certainly didn't know that it manifested differently in girls than it did in boys. Girls can also be super artsy. And on the flip side, hyper focused, like my best friend and I. So the second thing I wanted to bring up about this idea, this concept of girls having different symptoms, manifesting themselves in different ways, showing up in different ways, is impulsivity and extremes, right? And this idea of hyper focus. So my best friend is Dutch and extremely hyper clean. And I mean that in all the best ways ever. And she is fantastic because she never, ever, ever once judged me and my kind of sloppy, disorganized kind of housekeeping. Never has she ever judged me. And I was always the one who felt badly about like, oh my gosh, she's going to come over. She's going to see this mess. I'm so embarrassed. You know, this place is just kind of a pigsty. It's not picked up properly. Like, and because society, and I'll get into this later, I keep kind of saying these little things that I'm going to loop back to, but I am going to loop back because I have more to say on it, but it's not like the main point that I'm saying here. Does that make sense? So the deal with her is that, you know, I just did not feel comfortable having her come over and see my big mess. And she was not judging me at all. She never said anything. She often like would just pick up a broom and be talking to me, and she would start sweeping, and not because she thought it was gross, but because that's what she did out of just habit, you know? So we are both extremes, right? And we're extremes manifesting themselves differently. And so, when girls are in school, we're considered, maybe not called, but considered when undiagnosed, all right, lazy and unmotivated and not working to our full potential, or focused on all the wrong things, focused on this, that, and the other thing. I can't really relate. I did not struggle with hyperfocus. I struggled with more of like the ping-pongy mind, which I'm going to get into also. But the deal is you start to build this foundation of people in authority or teachers thinking that you're lazy and unmotivated. Your grades prove that. There's evidence, right? And why this is so scary, particularly for girls, is you're at this really pivotal time, like right before puberty, and then in middle school, and then in high school, right? And you see your friends around you, and everybody else is able to stay organized. Everybody else is learning how to study and what works for them, study skills wise. Their lockers are clean and organized. Yours is a mess. There's freaking papers flying out everywhere, right? And I'm running late to class. Maybe my assignment is done. Maybe it isn't. So as a girl, you have this real sense of foreboding that you're not enough and that you're not handed the keys to life like everybody else is. And you have this horrible feeling start to come over you like, what is wrong with me? Why is this easy for everybody else? And why is it sort of effortless for them to just handle all their stuff? And so what happens is, as girls, we turn it back on ourselves. And so that's what happened to me. And so because these symptoms are internal, girls are often labeled as, well, you're just sensitive, because we're not sitting there scratching our head and like stomping our feet and doing all that stuff like my classmate was, who sat across the room from me during the math quizzes. And, boys also present their symptoms earlier in life, typically, from my understanding from my doctors, like around age 7. And girls are a little bit later in life, like around 12, which kind of starts coupling with development. So then it's really easy to miss the signs because it's like, oh, well, her hormones are changing and this is normal for you to have these fluctuating feelings, if an adult is talking to a girl. So it's really hard to diagnose a girl. Nowadays, it's more common, obviously. But, when all of this came about, that like, oh no, girls can have it too, it was often missed. And we develop coping skills as girls, and they're not good ones necessarily. We do our best to cope with these symptoms. And when we're undiagnosed, we don't know why we're having them. And so here we are, doing the compare and despair. We're looking around at everybody else who has their shit together and we're despairing that we don't. And so, we're working harder to try and compensate for that. We're possibly making dangerous choices with boys, with friends, and we just have this feeling like I am so scared. I am just scared that I'm effing this up and I'm not good enough. And so we start to hide it. More on that later, right? Because ADHD materializes dramatically differently in girls as they get older. So boys, as far as I understand it from my doctors, tend to grow out of it. And I've seen this in my own sons. So boys tend to get better, but girls tend to get worse. And that, is what happened to me. I got worse. Okay. And so, because now I've had this lifetime of this stuff happening where I'm just always making careless mistakes, I'm forgetful, I can't prioritize, I'm struggling, starts to turn into, okay, now I'm in college. I'm having trouble with my relationships. I'm feeling needy because I cannot hold on to anything positive about myself because everything I do ends up in shambles, right? I'm missing deadlines. I'm turning in papers late. I'm showing up to choir practice. I don't have my shit with me that I need. I mean, stuff like that. So take years and years of this, and you really start to realize, like, oh, I'm kind of worthless. I'm kind of hogging up air and space on this planet that might be better occupied by somebody else. And then you get married. And for me, it was like, and here I am, and I'm married, and my husband is kind of perfect. And I'm still messed up old me trying to fake it till I make it through my life. And you fundamentally have this terrifying fear that you are not enough, that you never were enough, that you'll never be enough, because for some reason, you simply can't get your crap together and everybody else can. And it is a horrible feeling. And so I mentioned the ping ponging. So for me, I started having babies and I had postpartum depression. And so my whole life, I've lived with this kind of scatterbrained type thing. But now I'm a mom, right? And I am overwhelmed. I'm exhausted. And I feel like really there's got to be something wrong, because I also had the component of religious upbringing values that were supposed to keep me grounded and supposed to keep me stable. And I was supposed to just pray away anything that got in my way between God and me. And even that wasn't working. And I'm leading Bible studies, and I just still feel this horrible, terrible, suffocating feeling, just this constant rock bottom level of self-esteem, like I'm just a vapor and a waste. Chronic stress, not sleeping. My life is constantly out of control, right? My laundry was like never done, ever, perpetually never done. And I would leave an entire sink full of dishes and like take off, just leave the house, strap the kids in the car seat and just leave, because every household task seemed so overwhelming. I would be late for appointments or miss appointments. And so what happened to me was I started ping-ponging back and forth between depression and anxiety, depression and anxiety. And what it would be was this terrible fear, this actual anxiety, which led to panic attacks and stuff later, but that I was going to miss something or screw something up, or that I was screwing my kids up, which was even worse, right? So I'd have this terrible fear, and then I would get depressed over that fear because it would just be like, well, yeah, I'm feeling scared and anxious, like I'm screwing things up. And now I'm depressed because I'm looking back at all the evidence that I've built up over almost 4 decades, right? At that time of, yeah, you do screw things up. Yeah, you are a waste of space. Yeah, you just really, you've had a lot of time and you can't get your crap together, right? And so not realizing that like the actual ping pong ball was ADHD. Like that was the actual root. That was the root. So to treat the anxiety, depression, I drank because when I discovered that alcohol made me feel so much better, that was it for me. I just was like, thank you, God. I finally am not so focused on what a piece of shit I am. And alcohol worked for me for a while until it didn't work. But for a while, it was like freedom, man. It was like, thank you, God. I finally, for one night, don't feel like such a piece of crap. And so the next point I want to make is that I feel like the price of undiagnosed and untreated ADHD is far higher for women than it is for men, because my experience with the men that I know who have ADHD is that they kind of just blow it off and they're like, you know what? Fuck that shit. Like, oh, whatever. It's too hard. I'm not going to do it. And they blow it off and they do something else. And, they're on the football field in 20 minutes. And society has made that road pretty straightforward for them. But for women, I'm going to be bold and say that it is my belief that our society has done us zero favors in helping us understand that we cannot be perfect and that we cannot be all things to all people at all times. And not only has society done us zero favors, but those of us who have grown up in the church, same. Girl, same. And maybe even worse because, for me, now I'm married, right? And I'm like in my 30s. And I've got ringing in the back of my head this Proverbs 31 woman thing, which is this, excuse me, but it is a bullshit passage, in my opinion, in the book of Proverbs in the Bible. And it talks about this woman. She's worth more than rubies. She gets up at the ass crack of dawn and like basically like goes out and like, gathers the flax, and she's like making clothes and she's doing all this crap, and an impossible standard, even in today's equivalents, right? But that's what we've done to women. So I don't even know why we're surprised that all of us are crumbling and falling apart, or we were at some level before a diagnosis. It's rooted in shame. It is a shame-based parable in my mind. And And it's unfortunate. And so, because again, we're doing the compare and despair. So I was comparing my insides to everybody else's outsides. And so the natural reaction was, I better drink more because I don't measure up. I keep trying and I don't. And so that's where that anxiety and depression game of ping pong begins again, takes another round. And so this is also where self-harm comes in, because you actually believe there's something wrong with you. So whether that's eating disorders, using drugs, whatever it is, there are three main areas that I can think of. And this is part will tie up some of the loose ends that I had you put a pin in earlier. Three main areas for women where we've done a real disservice to them, in my opinion, through the channels of societal expectations and norms, although they're changing, not fast enough, and through the church. And mostly the church is the one that saddens me, because we're just so wedded to the past and wedded to the old ideals in church from the evangelical 80s and 90s, that the woman shall be at the right hand of her husband, all this old school misogynistic stuff. I digress. So the three main categories that I think personally have done women zero favors. Firstly is the home. So take, for example, a woman and her domestic partner. And if that domestic partner is a man and they are living together in marriage or not, this is just sad to me. But it is always the woman who is sort of inadvertently held responsible for different things. Like, you have somebody over for dinner. At least in my household, I'm cooking. My husband does not cook. And I don't feel like I'm rolling him under the bus. He would fully admit that. And he owns that. But some of these traditional roles that we have set in our marriage and we still have today were sort of ingrained in my husband and his old school culture and mine. And they both came from the church. Not to say that obviously there aren't men from those eras that cook, but it just wasn't super common yet, at least in our families. So you've got the home, right? And anything home decor that doesn't match or work well with the style of the home, the hardware choices on the cabinets, that is all, it ends up inadvertently being the woman's jurisdiction, in terms of the woman will get blamed a lot of times, or laughed at, or held responsible for. How could she, choose that? How could she choose that for their kitchen or whatever? It's like as if the woman somehow has the end all be all choice in the matter. And maybe in some domestic partnerships, that is true, but it is just still not seen as an equal role. And then, of course, you add children in there. So, of course, that's a whole nother thing. And I've told my husband that a major difference between him and me is that he goes to work and has teams of people, teams of assistants, teams that run different areas that he oversees. And at home, I am one person, right? Especially back then, because I don't even remember. I think we couldn't always afford house cleaners, so I was doing that too. But all the domestic tasks, right, pretty much fell on me, or it was my responsibility to figure it out, right? One person to do all the childcare. And I'm sorry, but if you have as many kids, and we had, let's see, by the time I was diagnosed, I think I had 7 kids, 6 or 7. So it was a lot, right? And I don't say that to paint the picture. These are like first world problems, but also not. Because when you start to look at that real serious card of self-harm that you're holding in your hand, it becomes dangerous quickly, right? And there are a lot of people out there, and we have become way more progressive with our domestic setup in the past 7 years, I would guess, particularly since I've been diagnosed with ADHD. But prior to that, we were in a deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, which is a totally different topic. But there were a lot of things that needed flat out rebuilding in our life and in our marriage. But that was one way from my life that we didn't do me any favors. Another way that we don't do women any favors by not diagnosing them and treating them is their hormones and their health. So I mentioned not sleeping, breastfeeding babies, all of the hormonal changes that happen to a woman over time, ups, downs, emotions, moods. Another sign of ADHD is an inability / difficulty to control emotions, being known as a Karen, called a Karen, right? As women in this area with hormones and our health, we are just constantly sucked dry. We are like a kid trying to squeeze the very last few drops out of a Capri Sun juice box, juice pouch, like twisting it, and the straw is making that telltale noise that it makes when it is just air. That was me for most of my 30s, and probably from age 25 on, because we didn't know it was okay to care for ourselves. We didn't know that that was a priority. Ergo, another reason why I drank, because I could drink and still cook dinner and still show up and look somewhat presentable until I couldn't, right? But it is the cognitive load as well. Speaking of hormones and health, it's carrying that cognitive load. Who has basketball practice? Who has swim lessons? How are we going to get them there? All of the details of everybody's lives except our own. Because as moms, and it's been this way forever, we are last on the list, right? That has done us no favors. And so when we're tired or frustrated or emotional, it's like that's because we have no gas left in our tank. None. Couple that with an undiagnosed case of ADHD, low self-esteem. Everybody else has their shit together but me. Why am I always missing things? Now I have anxiety because I'm afraid I'm going to miss things. That makes me depressed because I know I'm fucking everything up. It's a recipe for disaster. And that's what I faced. Still undiagnosed when I got my DUI with my 4 kids in the car and went off to rehab. And so the third way that we have not done women any favors is by having them put in a position where we have had to hide. So in 12-step programs, we call these feelings of restlessness, irritability, and discontentedness. And I would say those are lifelong challenges of people with ADHD as well. So I would get irritable at my kids, and then I would feel so terrible about it. And oh my gosh. And I'd go to them and I'd repent. Certain family members, I just felt like were always judging me, just rubbing it in, just really pouring salt in that shame wound. and I just had nothing left, And so you start to get, like, I had the alcoholism. I started to get like a spending problem, like I was doing a lot of shopping and then hiding what I had purchased because I didn't want my husband to know that I had purchased all this crap, right? Like, what kid needs like a $60 Easter dress, But I felt like at the time I had to hide. I had to hide all these problems because it was on me to get my shit together and I couldn't. So I would use these methods of escaping to hide behind. So because adult women with ADHD tend to be highly self-critical, this all adds up to me, right? But then you've got the church thing in there, and why isn't God solving this for me? And from the outside, we can make it look pretty good from our hiding space. We can make it look like we're spinning all the plates, we're juggling all the shit. But then when you go to our house and you open up the cabinet and you see all the crap that's inside that we just shoved in there, it's really indicative of a greater problem, right? And so for me, I'm going to move on to my personal diagnosis. So I'm going to jump into my DeLorean and I'm going to turn back the clock, right? And I'm going to tell you about a couple of my earlier experiences, but I'm going to start with the day that I was diagnosed with ADHD. So I had been seeing my shrink for depression and anxiety, that whole ping pong game. And he had encouraged me to please allow him to test me for ADHD. And I was off the charts because I was terrified that I either was a piece of shit or I was afraid I was going to become a piece of shit. And so now that I had ADHD, I was like, wonderful. I have another freaking problem, alcoholic, ADHD, what? And I did not see it at first as empowering, nor did I see alcoholism as empowering. I saw these things as negative. I learned to reframe them with time and therapy and treatment, but it all started to come together when I really embraced, no, wait a minute, this is who I am. And then it dawned on me, but it's not my fault. And that was huge. It was just huge for me because it took away a little bit of that guilt and shame. It was like, well, there's a reason. There's a reason for this. And as I learned more about ADHD and as I healed myself through the 12 steps and went through the process of making my recovery first in my life, pain was my great motivator. And over time, I started to realize this is really okay. It is really okay. It's just more information about myself. And that was empowering. I still struggle with different things. I so love my ADHD doctor because you get an email confirming your appointment like a month before. Then you get a text message about a week before. On the actual day of the appointment, you get like 4 text messages and a link. I didn't expect this. But I might make a part 3 because once again, I've been talking about this for a long time. So let me put a pin in my personal diagnosis right after that. And I'm going to tell you a couple more stories of guilt and shame. And then I'm going to give you some tools. So as always, remember to be kind, rewind. I want to thank you for the honor of your time. Take what you like and leave the rest behind.
Thank you so much for listening to Eternally Amy, a mum of 8's journey from jail to joy. Amy Liz Harrison is a best-selling author, speaker, 12-step coach, meditation teacher, and recovery advocate. To find out more, please visit amylizharrison.com. You can keep up with Amy on all platforms by following @AmyLizHarrison. Please subscribe and review this podcast. It means so much to us if you do.